at a later date on our YouTube channel. So I just wanted to say a quick thank you for all of your support. We rely on our members and volunteers to help us to care for Devon's wildlife, our nature reserves and wild places. So you may have heard that this is Remember a Charity Week, which happens every year, highlighting how important gifts in wills are to charities and how much we really do appreciate them. Making a will ensures that you can look after your loved ones and that your wishes are carried out. And if you would like to make a gift to charity in your will, it is relatively easy to do so and can make a lasting impact on our work. If you're interested in finding out more about leaving a gift in your will to Devon Wildlife Trust, then do please contact me. My contact details are with the invitation or will be sent out to you in an email over the next couple of weeks. Or please do take a look at our legacy pages on the website. So I'm sure you've heard enough from me. So to the main event. Matt Boydell is Devon Wildlife Trust Land Manager, responsible with his team and the help of some fantastic volunteers for looking after our 57 nature reserves across Devon. He's going to tell us all about Marsland and how legacies, small and large, have made a huge difference to the work that we've been able to do for wildlife. So over to you, Matt.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just quickly going to share my screen. Bear with me 1 minute. Fantastic. So, as Hannah said, I'm going to give a shortest sort of talk on Marsland Nature Reserve. I'm going to be honest, one of our best nature reserves. Tricky to encounter in 40 minutes. One of our oldest nature reserves was a nature reserve predating it coming to DWT to manage. Has a real history and fantastic habitat range there. So for that, I'm sure a lot of you will know where it is, but for anybody who doesn't know where it is or hasn't visited, Marsland's just on the North Devon Cornwall coast. In fact, the valley it sits in, the stream that runs down it is the county boundary between Devon and Cornwall. So Bude is sort of 20 minutes south, and then Bideford over to the west and Heartland above. Really interesting when you look at it. It looks a little bit like a sort of squash sort of lizard with one leg missing. Gary always describes it as. And this photograph, to be honest, isn't the best quality photograph. It's probably about 20 years old, but I wanted to show it just to demonstrate how the landscape looks and probably still looks today compared to how it used to look. So if you look at it now and over the last 20 years, it's predominantly been a woodland site. Coastal grasslands and scrub down near the coastal, down near Marsland Mouth, and with sort of open glades, grassland glades dotted through the woodland, but predominantly it is a woodland site. If you flick back to, I'll just flick back once. So the next photograph is actually just covering this section here. So in between these two and over. And this is a photograph from the late 1940s. So immediately after the war, there was a huge number of sort of reconnaissance planes still in the country, and the government decided to do a photographic record of all of the UK. So this would have been taken sometime in the late 1940s. Now, if you look on this map, so not that long ago, obviously 70 years now, but probably a lot of it was open grassland. So this section here is all woodland now, when we flip between the two, as you can see there. And then this section here, where it's still grassland now, on the next one, you can see it was grassland below as well. So all this has gone back to woodland. So although when you walk through Marsland, you tend to think of it as old ancient woodland, actually not that long ago, a lot of it was still farmed. Now, it's very steep ground if you don't know it, so it was always poor quality, sort of grazing land or, for arable. So it was never the greatest quality land, which is why it dropped out of production post-war. Now, the history of the site, I think, probably more than any of our sites, is connected to conservation, sort of at its very core. So Christopher Cadbury purchased the site. So Christopher Cadbury is a young boy, Christopher Cadbury from the chocolate family, Quaker family. As a young boy, he used to come and visit and stay in a house down in the valley. During the war, as a Quaker and pacifist beliefs, he didn't fight, but he was a fireman during the Blitz in Birmingham. At one stage, he had a near fatal accident. So to recuperate, he went back to the place he'd grown up and loved as a child and spent a number of months recuperating in Marsland. And while he was there, he promised himself that if he made it through the war and didn't get seriously injured again, after the war, he was going to come back and purchase as much of Marsland as he could. And this is partly reflects one of his core interests. Christopher Cadbury is sort of one of the forefathers of conservation. Helped purchase over 50 nature reserves across the world, was very much involved in conservation in the Galapagos Islands, has other sites in the UK that he helped purchase, was one of the former driving forces of the Wildlife Trust. So really, through the 1950s, he started to buy Marsland, employed a warden full-time to look after it. So Marsland was pretty much the size it is now in terms of the reserve ownership by the early 1960s, since which time it's had a permanent full-time reserve officer, or warden as they were called back then, on the site, who lived on site in a house on site. And that's a huge length of time. You could probably count on one hand the number of other sites and reserves in the country where you could have that level of sort of continuity. He unfortunately died in 1995, and 2 years later, in 1997, there was a memorial service at Marsland, which was always one of his favourite sites, always one of his closest, that he had the closest contact with, probably in part because of his connection to the war and recuperated there and as a child. David Attenborough, as you can see in the photograph, came down to unveil it, and a really important part of the history of Marsland. But it's not just the really big sort of legacies and donors and supporters that are really important at somewhere like Marsland and across a number of our sites. We have lots of people who incredibly generously give us small legacies, small gifts to help support us. The tractor at Marsland is now getting really old. We bought it, Gary bought it, who's the reserve officer there, not long after he started, so we still get it serviced. So Gary was the 4th warden at Marsland, and he's been there since April 1988. So in the early 90s, he bought the tractor, and that tractor was bought for us by a Scottish lady who we got chatting to and spent half a day showing around the woodlands, who just loved the site and thought it was wonderful and thought Gary's work was fantastic. And she got in touch and said she'd like to buy a tractor for him. We've had others of similar sizes, of different sizes and different gifts. So Frank Morton, who used to live in the house right in the bottom of the valley, left in his will some money and a field near the office, which is now an important part of the fabric of the site. Mrs. Manning and Gooseham, who loved to walk through the woods. Gary was really good friends with Gary. Gary spent a lot of time with her walking through the woods, looking at the different species. She left some of money in her will. And then Edward Oak, who also lived in Gooseham more recently, and this was in my time. So I've been here 14 years. So this is probably about 13 years ago. Left some money and a couple of fields, which the fields were sold because they weren't directly adjoining the reserve. We sold the fields, which we discussed with him, and we used those to help invest into upgrading and providing an office there, and to buy Beetland Wood, which was a new extension to the woodland. So that's partly what, in many ways, makes Marsland so remarkable from my point of view. The fact that it's had a full-time warden there since the early 1960s. Very much naturalist based in a modern sense, in quite an old-fashioned way for a nature reserve. And I don't say that in any negative way. It's just the ability to have somebody working on a site, on one site like that for so long, is just incredibly hard to maintain. What it does give us is a level of knowledge and understanding of that site that we can't really match on any of our others. So we have a recording system there that's got over 30,000 different records, not different species, but different records. The 34 butterfly species found within the woodlands and on the site generally, 18 dragonfly species, 320 different plants, 160 beetles. I mean, and obviously we have some real specialists who give our time as volunteers, connections that Gary, the reserve officer, has, and people have come and stayed with him in the past to help develop some of these species lists. Over 500 moths, 51 different hoverflies, 9 species of bats, and I'll be talking a bit about the bats and some of the other species, and then 115 species of bird. So, you know, a real plethora of biodiversity right through the site. So what is the site? Well, I should imagine there's a lot of people who visited Marsland who don't even realise they walked through Marsland, and their intention was never to visit Marsland, because lots of people will walk through the end of the reserve on the coast path. Typical North Devon, North Cornwall coastline, craggy, maritime grasslands, sort of short scrub blasted by the wind in the winter. You know, a really evocative place to be. And personally, down in that area, I like it when the weather's bad. You know, it feels as though it comes alive when you've got a howling gale coming through. And that's what a lot of people see, and that's probably what, you know, a lot of them will only ever see. But really, they're missing what some of the real beautiful aspects of Marsland. Yeah, I mean, don't be wrong. So this is Gull Rock, which is also part of the reserve. That coastline is stunning, and walking along the coastline is a treat. But people should take the time or a day to head into the reserve itself. So this is probably, it's a bit of a flat photograph, admittedly, but this is sort of Marsland, one of the habitat types you would expect to see. Open glades, little bits of coppice, woodland behind, more dense high canopy woodland behind, and these mixes of bracken, coppiced areas, grassland swards, just that general mix. We're also really lucky, they've got a really good connected wetland area, so there's a couple of larger ponds like this one. There's a number of small ponds dotted through the sites. There's a stream with tiny little tributaries run into it that runs all the way down the valley. And then we've got a range of little wet, sort of marshy areas dotted through the site as well. But probably, if you thought of Marsland, and I thought of Marsland, probably the first thing I would think of is oak woodland. This is certainly my favourite tree on the site. Sort of really old, amazing form. Obviously grew in the open when it grew, so it would have been surrounded by fields, and you can tell that because it spread so much rather than growing up vertically. And obviously it was a pollard of some sorts, so you know, it's not very tall, and then it branches off multi-stemmed. And this type of oak woodlands, really important in a UK context and in an international context. Very common along the north, that sort of northern Atlantic seaboard, dominated by the weather and the soils as you head up, and quite a speciality of that Atlantic coastline. So going back to the office, when I mentioned earlier, when I first started 13, 14 years ago, Marsland actually was more akin to how the Wildlife Trust started, that there was no office there. So when I used to go up and meet Gary, who'd already been there for, what would it be? So he's been there 32 years, so something like 18 years, 17 years when I started. I used to go and meet him, and we'd meet in his house and catch up. And it always felt like there's a slight opportunity missing, that it's a great place for a small office that you can choose to meet people in. So as I say, with some of the money that Edward Oak gave, and Frank and Mrs. Manning, we decided we'd develop a small office there. So this is what was there. This end building really was the store at the time, a machinery store and tools. That was becoming problematical because we had a small, at that time, Lesser Horseshoe Bat colony started and to use the building. So going in and out of it isn't really ideal from a disturbance point of view. And these buildings used to be a piggery. So with some extra funding and the funding from the legacies, we developed what I think, when you look at it now, an absolutely stunning office. What was really important to us was it had to add to the fabric of the site, and it didn't detract from the site. So it's made from natural local stone. It's got a cedar roof. And when you look at it, this is the new machinery store. This is a little storage area with a toilet and shower in. This area through here is where we have sort of a small library, microscopes. We can have small groups in to do ID work. This is a little office for Gary and other staff, occasional staff, to use, but obviously we can break out into there, we have an event. And the end building that had the bats in was completely changed and modified to make it really suitable for bats. The end gable end was falling out before, so it wasn't going to remain as a viable maternity roost for bats for long. And this is what it looked like after we'd done, this was just gone on at this point. So now, obviously, it's all weathered in, this end bit was finished, and now it looks incredibly natural from above. The whiteness of the gravel's gone, and it all blends into the landscape. Behind the bit of that office just used to be sort of scruffy grassland originally. And again, because people come and utilise the site, and we want to give people ideas and of different things they can do for their own house, in their own gardens, Gary slowly developed a wildlife garden that is made up of, you know, sort of native flowering plants that flower through the season that are really good for nectar sources for insects. We've got habitat piles, you know, water, all the usual things we would talk to people and encourage them to put into their, try and incorporate parts into their garden. And now I've got a short video, it'll come up in a second. So after we did all this work on the Lesser Horseshoe end building, the numbers of the Lesser Horseshoes started to really increase. And we ended up with peak numbers of about 160, 170 bats. This is a mother with her youngster, and the youngsters sort of hang, in a minute, will hang out, and it's still at that stage where it's trying to exercise its wings. So it's hanging onto mother's chest and exercise its wings and build some strength up. I should imagine that's quite annoying. So slowly she gets it back under control, pulls it back in, and in a minute she'll take off and fly. And that's it. So she's just stretching her own wings, and then she has a fly round the maternity roost in a second and disappears. And obviously that's taken in very low light level conditions. So this is Lesser Horseshoe, where someone who is a licensed bat officer went in and took a photograph quickly for us. And you know, it's quite a remarkable sight when you see, you know, a couple of 150 of them all hanging up there, particularly because probably 13 years ago we were getting, we were getting perhaps 10 or so. People obviously underpin a lot of what the Wildlife Trust do. It's how the Wildlife Trust started. It's what galvanised them in the first place. But I find it remarkable. I grew up in the 70s to think in the 1950s, post-war, where I know South East Dartmoor got its first tractor. I mean, that's, you know, it's that period we're talking about, immediately post-war, where people were already concerned about changes in habitat, loss of species, and started to get together to preserve areas through local county wildlife trusts. So people have always, and volunteers have always underpinned the Wildlife Trust movement. So this is the little office with the microscope bits in, the library. So there's a wall with books on this side that we use for groups. Actually, this is, a number of these are staff. So this was an event Gary put on to look at hoverflies, where they looked at hoverfly ID and habitat requirements and how you can sort of change bits of management to incorporate and benefit hoverflies. But we use this room for lots of groups. Lots of groups come to look at different species, some of which I'll be talking about as we go on. These fantastic people from Petrock School, College, and they came out for a number of years, different groups, to help us deliver management on site. So they worked at Marsland, they also worked across some of our Colne sites, and provide us with a labour source to able to get what is quite manual work done at times. And actually it's great fun for the team because Gary works up there on his own a lot of the time, It's really nice having a group of people who love the site, working with you for a day. And here they're actually cutting bracken and some of the scrub, and they've been raking it up. I'll explain why a little bit further into the talk. And here's Gary himself with the group. So here he's given a guided walk around Marsland. He does a lot of these through the year, particularly related to some of the butterfly work that I'll be talking about shortly. Obviously, 32 years having lived and worked on the site now, I can't really emphasise enough just what a difference that makes if you have a guided walk. If you ever get the opportunity or see the option to have a guided walk through Marsland with Gary, I would definitely take it up. Every time I go, I definitely learn something, because he's always pointing out something that he hasn't mentioned to me in the past. And as part of these sort of days, we have a little outdoor area, so we're not in the office all the time. So this is obviously in the summer. So these people would have been out having a guided walk, doing some ID work, and in the past, Gary's run some photography courses there, one with people who used to work for the BBC. So we've run a whole range of work there. And in the winter, this is Kate, who used to be in the reserves team, one of the reserves assistants, now works for the Working Wetlands Project as an advisor. And Kate ran for a couple of winters sort of woodland management and woodland products sort of day, where you look at traditional ways. So this is obviously making a hurdle, traditional ways of making woodland products and how that linked to the management of the sites. So then we come to the management. Obviously, the range of management that actually occurs across the site is really hard to capture in a short talk, and it's really quite encompassing. There's lots of access work, gate work, infrastructure work, maintaining the site safety. So I'm really going to focus on just three sort of the main things that underpin some of the core species work we do at Marsland. So this is a bracken and scrubby slope. We manage the scrub and bracken and their sort of edge effect with the woodland every year, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a second, because this forms a core part of the work that's done every year. One of the real features of Marsland as you walk through it is some of the open grassland glades that, if left completely unmanaged, they want to go to succession. So if there was no management at all through these glades, the scrub would come in, the woodland would slowly enclose, and this would revert back to a closed canopy. And there's some really important grassland species, butterfly species, a whole range of invertebrates that live within the grassland swards themselves and these open areas and along the edge. So this edge effect between the grass and the woodland is a really important habitat. So that's another key management area that we really focus on. And then the last one will be a woodland one. So obviously the bulk of Marsland is a woodland site. A lot of it we do very little management in, and we just leave it to just as it is. But we also do coppice work, small coppice areas like this one. So you can see into the back of this where it's just a high canopy and it's quite dark and gloomy underneath. And that's fantastic habitat in its own right, but for thousands of years, we've coppiced woodlands. All of the woodland, all the ancient woodland you can think of, historically has always been managed. And it would have been managed through coppicing, which is you cut the tree down. It doesn't kill it. If it's a broadleaf tree, it doesn't kill the tree. And as I'm sure you know, you fell the tree and you get lots and lots of stems shooting up, which is the coppice growth. And how you manage that coppice growth gives you different products, from fence posts to making hurdles with, depending on the trees and what you want to do. The benefit from a conservation point of view is it lets light down into an area. So for years, it could be dark, you let light down, you get this explosion of green. And we can modify that by leaving standards within it. So we'll leave single trees that we don't coppice, or we can just coppice a whole area, which is more like this is. So again, we get that a real variety of habitat types. And in the back here, you can see an area that was coppiced a few years, probably 2-3 years before, where the coppice stills have started to grow up again. And slowly, all this area would close off and these plants would get shaded out again. So we'll go back to I'll cover most of those as we go forward. So I'm sure realistically, what you really want to hear about is some of the species. The management work's great to do, it's really interesting, but people really want to see what's there. So if I was to say one thing that I think a lot of people would have heard of Marsland for, it would be fritillary butterflies. In particular, it would be pearl bordered and small pearl bordered, and then more recently, marsh fritillary we've also been focusing on. So a bit about the species itself. So the fritillaries, most of the fritillaries, their main requirement is they need common dog violets because it's the food plant for their larvae. So there's two main ways they would get large numbers of violets. Historically, the woodland management I was just talking about, where you coppice, when the light hit the floor, depending on the habitat type, you would get a big flush of violets. So the fritillaries would move in. A few years later, that habitat would have started to close up as the coppice comes up, so the violets will disappear, get covered by bramble, and they'll get shaded out. But every year in a woodland, in a woodland that was managed for hundreds of years, there would have been a new coppice area. So there would always have been little patches of perhaps half an acre or an acre, little coops that would have been full of violets. So the fritillaries used to bounce around the woodland following the woodland manager. And we still have some woodlands in the UK, a small number where coppicing happens and you still do get fritillaries following it. What Gary, probably more than anyone realised, was when he first started 32 years ago, we used to get very, very low numbers. He perhaps counted 4 or 5 or 6 pearl bordered and small pearl bordered fritillaries. And they weren't in the woodlands so much, the coppiced areas, they were in these bracken slopes, scrubby bracken slopes. The trouble with the bracken, it's quite smothered, so you only get small little patches of violets, so we never had many fritillaries. What Gary realised was that the bracken itself, if you imagine the top of the bracken when it's a canopy is waist high, you can mimic what you do with a woodland canopy. So in the winter, he cuts and scrapes and breaks up some of this bracken litter. When it's green and high in the summer, he will cut some of it, not all of it, just patches. And the result is you get these mats of violets. Now that's like a big open fridge, really, for pearl and small pearl fritillaries. That's just what they need. And this is what you find. So we get pearl bordered fritillary larvae, they come in and we get good numbers and they'll munch away on violet leaves. This is a pair that are mating, beautiful butterflies. They're slightly in the shade, these, the way the photograph's taken, because they really ping when they're fresh. They really stand out, really beautiful insects. And if you look, you can see when just the level of detail on them is just fantastic. And then we have small pearl borders. So the pearls come first. So they will be early April when it's a little bit cooler, and they tend to be up on the slopes a little bit more at Marsland, in amongst more of a bracken and bare earth sort of litter mix. Once we get into May, the numbers start to drop and the small pearls come in. And they like it a little bit lower down on the slopes, and they tend to thrive more in the areas where there's a bit more of a grass and violet and bracken mix. Again, they look very similar. Middle of April is really straightforward. If you see a fritillary of this size, it will be a pearl. Once you get to the end of May, it's very likely to be a small pearl. There's a bit in early May where they are very tricky to tell apart unless you know, unless you're quite good and know your fritillaries. What you do know is if you see them, they're very rare. Pearls have probably declined the most out of the two, and numbers have dropped by say 70%. Small pearls have decreased by around 60%. So really significant losses. So this is a photograph, and this is what makes one of the things that makes Marsland so special. Most places you go, you see these sorts of fritillaries in really quite small numbers. Gary's argument has always been, like most species of butterfly, what they want to do is be in big numbers. If you give them the right habitat and the weather's been good, they will be there in good numbers. So this was taken in May this year. So this is just small pearls just roosting together. It's a little bit windy, breezy day, so probably just dropping out of the, you can see they're sunning themselves, just dropping out of the wind a little bit and warming up. And this is really rare. And if you catch it on a still day, middle of April, middle of May, when either species are at their peak numbers, on a still day, they just flit along all around you, all through the bracken and the undergrowth. I mean, it is remarkable, and it's a real speciality of Marsland. When I started 13 years ago, Gary used to get very, well, not occasional, but you'd probably see over the course of the whole season, perhaps 6 or 7 marsh fritillaries. These fly slightly later in June, and their food plant is scabious, field scabious. So it's like one of the ones that has a slightly different food plant. So it likes a wetter grassland. And over the last 10 years, Gary's been pushing the scrub back in the valley bottom bit in a couple of areas where we've got a habitat that looks a little bit like a culm grassland. So a bit like some of the culm reserves we have, but on a lot smaller scale. And those culm wet grasslands are where we sort of associate marsh fritillaries. But these little patches that we've cleared and opened up in at Marsland, it's amazing. You know, we now get counts of, you can count 30 or so when you're walking around there in the day. And it's in quite a small area and quite a small time scale that, a little bit of scrub work, give them the habitat, their scabious comes back a bit more, and they just respond immediately. So, yeah, another one of the marsh fritillaries. Again, their antennae are amazing. I meant to say at the beginning, all of these photographs are perhaps from part of the Dipper, are all photographs from Marsland. And I don't know that Gary's taken every single photograph, but he's probably taken 99% of them. And the last 2 fritillaries we get there that we don't really do any particular management work for, silver washed, again, that obviously they do respond because their food plant again is the violet, but they're associated more with the glades and in the woodland. And then dark green. So dark green from a reserves point of view, I tend to associate more on our Dartmoor sites. Close association with bracken and the high brown fritillary habitats. Very similar to look at. I definitely wouldn't want to try and ID the difference without capturing them. The difference is like sort of a silver spot. I'm sure there's others, but I need to see them really close up and still. They're big butterflies. If they're out, they're normally moving fast. We have occasional records of the dark green at Marsland. Isn't one of the main butterflies there by any stretch. And then other key butterflies, so green hairstreak, again, nationally, 30% decline, sort of has various food plants, but at Marsland, probably focusing on birdsfoot trefoil and the gorse and bramble, flies May, June. It's a great photograph of it, but if you see them firsthand and the sun's on them, they're really iridescent. You can just sort of make it out there. And then purple hairstreak. A lot of people would think it's not that common a species, I should imagine, but actually it's actually quite common in a woodland setting, and you do get quite a lot of them. So they're, sorry, what's my thread then? So they're high oak canopy specialists, and the adults, they're generally fly in July and August, and they feed on the honeydew on the oak leaves. One of my favourites, and I put this up really just to flag up that they don't have to be rare to be special and amazing. I mean, this is common blue butterfly, found through numerous types of grassland habitat right across England. If you catch it in the sun and you get a close look at them, they're beautiful. I mean, they're such amazing blue colours. And again, birdsfoot trefoil, and they fly right through from the middle of May through to the end of September. If it's a really warm year, you'll still be seeing them in October. And then one of my favourites, one that always makes me smile, orange tit. So a grassland species again. At Marsland itself, it's associated with cuckoo flower. There are other plants, but at Marsland, it likes the damper, grassier areas, and its larvae will feed on cuckoo flower. So that's one habitat type. One of the other big ones is the wetland areas. Now, this is really more of a series of photographs just to show you the range of dragonflies we get there. And sorry, so this is a photograph of a southern hawker, and you can see where it's come out of its larval case. So if you don't know the life cycle to dragonflies, obviously they'll mate. The female will come back and she'll lay eggs either directly into the water or onto emergent vegetation, either just above or just below the water level. The eggs hatch sometime later, and then you get these nymphal stages, and these will live in the water for 1 to 3 years, depending on the species and food availability, environmental conditions. And these are amazing things. They're one of those ones that you're quite glad they're really tiny. Voracious predators. So this has just come out. So this is the casing of the southern hawker. So this did have the dragonfly in it. It's come out of its back, and where it's gripped on, the dragonflies, emerged, hardened off, flown away, and it's just left this empty casing and shell, and so it's still clinging on to the reed coming out of the water. And this is what we call a tendril. So again, still the same species, southern hawker, and you can see what its colour is. It's quite green when it first comes out. The wings, look quite floppy. At this stage, it's just pumping and sort of blowing itself up, and needs to dry, and its exoskeleton sort of needs to dry and harden off. And this is what it looks like sometime later. Remarkable colours, and just remarkable flyers. So from an aeronautic point of view, I can't imagine we'll ever produce anything that can fly quite adeptly as a dragonfly can. We have a number of species, none of them hugely rare at Marsland, but 15 different species, I think I said, my brain's gone blank. And so this is full-spotted chaser, quite obvious why it's the full-spotted. You can count them on the wings. Remarkable colours. Tends to like flying, tends like all of our ones at Marsland, associated with small ponds really, possibly slow-moving water. And again, really close-up shot of it. You can see just the remarkable nature of the, and clarity in the wings. Broad-bodied chaser, this is a really easy one to identify. So this is another tendril. You can tell that because the wings are really translucent and not hardened off, and the colour's not fully formed. This is it, once it's been out and formed, dried off properly, not the same one, and you can see how its wings are blackened off. Broad-bodied chasers are often some of the first ones to find. Again, they like small ponds, and often one of the first species to colonise a new pond. And this is just a great photograph because, like in most animals and insects, you get the old sort of genetic aberration. And this has come out. It's a broad-bodied chaser, and it's a mix of 2 different colours, and it's just not quite right. The last 2 I'm going to mention briefly, probably my favourite to look at, the black-tailed skimmer. Lake ponds, you will get it in the slow-moving areas in the stream. Will survive, the nymphs will be fine in marshy areas as long as there's a little bit of open water. And the last one, kill skimmer. And again, streams, pools, has an association with heathland in a lot of sites. So you will get it resting on heather plants and hunting in amongst heather. So not the last few, but 108 species of birds. Probably the most exciting one for some time from my point of view, Searle bunting. So Searle buntings had a huge decline. By 1989, we were down to like 118 pairs in the UK, or certainly England, and those were pretty much restricted, were totally restricted to a handful of small geographical areas in South Devon. A huge amount of work in the conservation world through working with landowners, trying to change management practices, reintroductions in South Devon and then down in Cornwall, in the south of Cornwall on the coast, has led to a recovery where there's now over 1,000 pairs. Still predominantly the largest percentage along the South Devon coastline, but spreading out into East Devon, 65 pairs and a successful reintroduced reduction in South Cornwall. And then 2 years ago, we had the first breeding pairs at Marsland. And it doesn't really surprise me. It's just having the numbers for them to find it, really, because it's perfect. What they like in the summer, from a breeding point of view, is they're insect eaters. a key species is small grasshoppers for the chicks. So somewhere like Marsland, down at the coastal end, with the coastal grassland, lots of structure to the grassland, different heights, different scrub, completely unimproved, just provides the perfect sort of food source for their chicks. And the hedgerow along the top, and then the really thick, managed sort of low gorse and blackthorn provides the perfect places for them to nest in. So really exciting addition to the site that would have been there historically, that had been missing for years and has come back again. I think this is probably my favourite bird generally, actually, the dipper. I spend a lot of time on rivers, and the dipper just always makes me smile. Charismatic. For people who've been involved with Devon Wildlife Trust for a number of years, will remember no doubt that it used to be the logo of Devon Wildlife Trust, the dipper, and such a charismatic bird. So they'll bounce up the river, hopping through, flicking up stones, looking for insects, and then remarkably, they would just disappear into pools and swim completely aquatic under the water, digging out sort of mayfly nymphs, caddisflies, eating various sort of shrimps and different ones. If it's a small meal, they'll eat it while they're still underwater. They use their wings, and they'll even grab onto rocks while they're underwater, while they're rooting around for stuff. If it's a bigger meal, sort of like a minnow or a stickleback, they normally come out and hop onto a rock like this. And we've had breeding dippers in the stream for the last 5 or 6 years at Marsland. One of the things that one of our legacies, a small legacy, helped us pay for was Gary's always been aware we've had otters, infrequently at sometimes using the reserve. So we put in a couple of small ponds near the stream and an otter holt. And I guess we spent more time surveying for them. Now, this was footage taken in, I think it was 2010. It was on the BBC as well. They used Gary's footage. And this is the mother and her little otter cubs heading upstream. And you can see the size of the stream. I mean, you can hop across it in places, but it's perfect. Full of stone lopes, bullheads, got good population of brown trout in it. You'll have eels heading up there. Obviously, all the ponds nearby will have newts and frogs in. So the perfect sort of quiet, undisturbed habitat for them. And from here, at the top, they can spread out at the top of the valley, and easily, when they get older, spread out and head off into the Tamar if they so wish. Beautiful footage, and really excited. I remember saw them once with Gary briefly, just the adults, not the young. And it is quite remarkable. There's such a small little stream that supports, so many places for them to feed. Fantastic sight. Just let me try and flick through. And then to finish, going back to our coppice management really, and just that manipulating the general structure of a woodland. So the grass in the corner, that's the edge of sort of like where the photograph is taken, that's the edge of like a grassy glade. This area is sort of a scrubby, brackeny area that's been cut, partly being managed at this point in time for fritillaries. Then you can see the coppice growing back up in places, and then coppice at different heights coming through the edge, and then, high canopy behind. This is the perfect sort of habitat mix on a whole for these little fellas. Dormouse. Now the open area is no good to them, but this open area over time will go into these sort of young coppice areas. So what the dormouse really needs is good cover. It's an arboreal species, so it very rarely comes on the ground, so it needs lots of trees, but ideally it doesn't want big old closed canopy trees because they're dark underneath, so things don't fruit and flower as well. So in the spring, early spring, he'll be up on the tops of oak trees, munching on oak flowers, eating honeysuckle flowers, and just moving around through the canopy. When you get through the summer, he'll be eating a range of things through different fruits that are coming in, different seeds. Then you get to this time of year, and he's just reaching the point where he's getting as fat as he can possibly get, and he's been gorging away on blackberries, different fruits, rose hips, hazelnuts, getting ready for the winter. And it's the winter really where they really come down to ground level. So in the next few weeks, once the temperatures start to drop, he'll have made himself a little circular nest, and this is where this photograph was taken from. He'll have made a little circular nest, really tight, of grass, probably buried at the foot of some scrub or a tree that's really well buried under vegetation. And at that point, he will pretty much go to sleep for the winter. Now, like most mammals, when they hibernate, if it gets really warm, he'll wake up, which isn't particularly a good thing. Ideally, because there won't be much to eat probably, so ideally he wants to sleep straight through. And he will perhaps go to sleep, and that could be it for 6 to 7 months. So one of the things we always make sure when we're managing for all through the woodland is that it's trying to get this balance between making sure when we go in and cut coppice that we don't remove his habitat because he wants this. And when we cut areas for the fritillaries, we allow some of it to develop into this habitat that gives more scrub, and that we allow it to be connected through the landscape and through the valley. So species like this dormouse can move and migrate, and they've got different areas to move into when they have young, so we can maintain really good populations. So I'm going to finish there, and hopefully that's given you a flavour of Marsland Nature Reserve, and we'll give you, if you haven't visited before, we'll make you perhaps think about popping out there, going and having a look and having a visit and seeing just what a remarkable site it is. So I'll hand back over to Hannah briefly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. That was a fantastic talk. We have a few questions to get through. So the first one, what do you see the future of Marsland Nature Reserve looking like? Does being so close to the coast affect which plants will thrive at this reserve?
Yeah, I suppose you do get a drift of sea salt, but that is that's quite localised, to be fair. So obviously the type of species you get on the maritime cliffs, like sea thrift and those types, are very much maritime plants. So they're designed to cope with a really harsh environment, a bit like if you're up in the Alps, the alpine plants similarly are very specialised. They're designed to cope with a very harsh climate. That effect, I think, quite quickly dissipates as you move inland, but the actual oak woodlands themselves are sort of a factor of that Atlantic coastline. So, you know, if you spend any time in the woods along the North Atlantic coast, you know, it's quite a wet area. You get a lot of sea mist coming in, so you do get great air quality. If you stand and look out from the beach at Marsland, there's nothing until you get to the United States. So, you know, pollution levels are about as low as you can get. So you do get fantastic lichens hanging. So it does provide probably a slightly damper climate than, say, where I live in East Devon. So the woodland feel at Marsland is influenced by its maritime nature.
Great, thanks. What's the most unexpected species recorded at Marsland, and why is it unexpected?
I'm trying to think. This is the downside. So I should say, I'm going to make an excuse here, obviously, because I oversee all of the nature reserves, all 58. I'm probably not the best person to come up with the real rarest. I mean, years ago, which isn't really particularly, years ago there were high brown there, but I think that was, I don't think that's particularly what the question's asking. We had a hoopoo there a few years ago, Gary said. Some of the migrant birds would be definitely, so it's a great place for migrants. We could provide, I could ask Gary, so when we send out the link with more information, I'll ask Gary to give me his 5 most random species that he's seen there. Because he, having been there for 32 years, he will have seen some really random stuff that should never be there. I just don't have that detail.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. How is the site used by locals, visitors and volunteers?
It's quite a remote site. Locally, it's quite well used. So it's not near any major settlements, obviously. There's lots of coastline that people access and woods close to them. But it is popular, it's very popular with naturalists. So we get a lot of really keen naturalists go there on arranged groups and just getting in touch to say, can they spend a few days down there? And then locally, the footpath network. So there's a footpath runs right down through the valley to the beach and then links up onto the coast path and other footpaths sort of traversing the valley from, across the shorter route. So you can head from Goosen up to Morwenstow and stuff through the valley itself. In terms of regular volunteer groups, it's interesting. Gary was just saying he's got a couple of people locally who would like to perhaps get involved as being local wardens, with sort of spending more time on the site to feed back to him and helping him keep an eye on it. We don't have a really regular local group there. It's not the easiest place to get to, whereas say some of our sites like sort of Bystock, Bovey, Meath, they lend themselves more to bigger groups. But when we have the opportunity, we have volunteer groups there.
Great, thank you. And I think probably the final question. So do you have a favourite part of the reserve, and if so, why?
Yeah, it probably around, it's slightly opened up. So where a lot of the work happens, as you head down the valley, there's a bit that's not visited much, and it is where the ponds are. That sort of, it feels a bit like Louisiana type swamp habitat. It's really wet. There's quite marshy ground through there. I've got to say, it's not somewhere I go a huge amount, but I think for that feeling that you're in the middle of nowhere, it's hard to beat that. The other one I would say is, as you walk down the valley and hit the beach, it is a stunning location. The rock formations, I mean, it is really important from a geological point of view, that whole stretch of coastline. So you can't get away if you have a beautiful walk through the valley, you see lots of stuff, and then you get down to the beach, and the coastline there is just remarkable.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you everyone for joining us, and for our colleague Emmy, who's been doing the tech for us. And Matt, that's a really great insight into Marsland. As to everyone else, if you have any questions regarding making a will or how to leave a gift in your will to charity, then do please contact me. I usually work on a Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. If you've enjoyed this talk and would like to make an extra donation towards our work, then please do visit our website under the donation section, and that would be really fantastic. But many thanks again for all of your support to date, for Devon Wildlife Trust and for the precious wildlife of Devon. Thank you and good night.
Okay, bye everyone.